Have you ever stopped to think about the depth of your prayers? Often, our requests are hasty, almost automatic, as if we were filling out a wish list. But what is the real purpose behind what we ask? Will we understand the impact of this on our lives and the world around us? The Apostle James warns us about this danger when he says, "You ask and do not receive, because you ask amiss, that you may spend it on his pleasures." James 4:2-3. These words resonate like a mirror, reflecting the superficiality with which we often approach God. Imagine a farmer planting seeds without knowing what type of harvest he wants. He scatters the seeds haphazardly without planning, and then becomes frustrated when he sees a mixture of plants, some useful, others invasive. In the same way, asking for something without clarifying it on purpose is like sowing without discernment. The result can be disorderly or worse, harmful. When we ask without wisdom, we can end up accepting something that, far from blessing us, takes us away from the true purpose for which we were created. The Bible is full of examples of people who asked God for misaligned purposes. Consider the Israelites in the desert. After being freed from Egypt, they began to cry out for meat, longing to return to the illusory comfort of slavery, instead of trusting in God's provision. Numbers chapter 11 verses 4-6. They asked for something that seemed good to their eyes, but that came from a dissatisfied and ungrateful heart. God granted their request, but the result was devastating. Meat has become a source of protection, not pleasure. This shows us that, without a purpose aligned with God's will, victories can even turn into burdens. Now, think about the story of Solomon. He had the opportunity to ask for anything, but he chose something beyond himself, wisdom to rule justly. Therefore give your servant an understanding heart to judge your people, so that he may prudently discern between good and evil. 1 Book of Kings, chapter 3, verse 9. This request pleased God so much that Solomon not only received wisdom, but also riches and glory. The difference between him and the Israelis in the desert is motivation. Solomon asked for something that would benefit others and honor God's will, while the Israelites asked for something that would only satisfy their desires immediately. An analogy that can help understand this concept is the lost browser. Imagine someone on the open sea, asking for a strong wind to transfer their boat, but without a clear destination. The wind can take you anywhere, including a shipwreck. Asking God without understanding why is like sailing aimlessly. Wisdom is the map that helps us understand not only what to ask for, but also why we ask for it. Jesus also gave us a practical example in his prayers. In the Garden of Gethsemane, he asked that the cup of suffering be distant, but added, "Yet not as I will, but as you will." Gospel of Matthew, chapter 26, verse 39. This teaches us that even in our moments of greatest anguish, we must submit our requests to God's will, noting that He knows what is best for us. Many of us, in moments of desperation, ask for things without considering the consequences. We want quick solutions, immediate interruptions, answers that meet our urgency. However, are we too eager to wait for the right answer? When we ask without thinking about why, we run the risk of becoming like children, asking for sweets without thinking about the side effects. Wisdom is in aligning our desires with the principles that God teaches us. Instead of simply asking for success, we can ask for the ability to use success to help others. Instead of asking for money, we can ask for wisdom to manage what we have. Instead of asking for happiness, we can ask for strength to find joy in any circumstance. This type of prayer not only transforms what we receive, it also transforms who we are. An example that illustrates this is in the story of blind Bartimaeus. When he cried out to Jesus, many sought to silence him, but he persisted. When Jesus approached, he did not assume what Bartimaeus wanted, but asked, "What do you want me to do for you?" Gospel of Mark, chapter 10 verse 51. This question is essential. Bartimaeus knew exactly what he wanted, to regain his sight. His clear intention was rewarded and he received his healing. In our lives, perhaps it's time to stop and ask, why am I asking this? Does my request reflect a selfish desire? Is it aligned with something greater? There is nothing wrong with asking, but it is essential to ask with understanding. When we align our desires with God's will, we not only receive what is good, but we also become instruments to bless others. May our prayers be like a farmer's seeds, healthy, planted with purpose, watered with faith, and unique for a harvest that brings honor to God and blessing to many. Number 2, the art of being quiet before asking. Many times, in the rush to present our needs to God, we forget something essential: silence. Have you ever stopped to think that silence could be the space where wisdom is born? Asking without first being silent is like shooting an arrow without aiming. It is not for nothing that the psalmist declared, "In silence, I wait for the Lord, my soul waits for him." Psalms chapter 62, verse 1. This silence is not empty, it is full of listening, reflection, and preparation to ask with clarity and purpose. Imagine a citizen who, without observing the soil, begins to plant seeds. He doesn't analyze the land, doesn't remove stones, doesn't fertilize, he simply spreads the sensations and hope for the harvest. This impulsive act is elaborated into a prayer without introspection. Silence before the request is like preparing the soil. It is in Him that we understand our motivations. We purify our desires and align our requests with what really matters. Jesus, in several graces, gave us an example of the importance of silence. Before making big decisions, He looked for a distant place to pray. In the Gospel of Luke, chapter 6 verse 12, we read that, in those days, Jesus withdrew to the mountain to pray, and spent the night praying to God. This period of silence was not passivity. It was a moment of alignment, where He sought wisdom to act. By remaining silent, Jesus teaches us that silence is not a waste of time, but a way of preparing the heart for what is to come. A practical example of how silence transforms requests is in the story of Anna, Samuel's mother. She was distressed, wanting to have a child. But before asking, Anna entered a moment of deep introspection and silent prayer in the temple. Her words were so intimate that the priest Eli thought she was drunk. However, it was in this fervent silence that his request was purified and aligned with God's will. Hannah didn't just ask for a child, she asked for someone who would serve a greater purpose. Being silent before asking is like waiting for the water in a murky river to calm down to see the bottom. Often, our emotions, anxieties, and desires make our vision confusing. Without silence, the waters calm, allowing us to see clearly what we really need and why we are asking for it. Without this pause, we run the risk of asking impulsively, guided more by fleeting emotions than by real needs. There is a dilemma we will all face at some point. How do we know if what we're going back to is the right one? The answer is in silence. It gives us space to discern between what we want and what we really need. Often, when we shut up, we realize that what we considered a priority may not be so essential. This pause frees us from many hasty requests and teaches us to trust that an answer will come at the right time. The metaphor of an art applies perfectly here. A sculptor does not begin to carve without first observing the stone block. He needs to see the imperfections, imagine the final shape, and plan each stroke. Likewise, before asking, we need to observe our own hearts, identify our desires, and plan our words. This process is not a barrier. It is a preparation that makes our requests more meaningful and effective. In the book of Ecclesiastes, chapter 3, verse 7, we read that there is a time to be silent and a time to speak. This wisdom teaches us that silence is not the absence of action, but an essential step before any manifestation. When we learn to be silent before asking, we not only strengthen our faith, but we also become more aware of our connection with God. Silence teaches us humility. He reminds us that we don't have all the answers, and that, before asking, we need to consider our limitations. This attitude contrasts with the culture of immediacy in which we live, where we want instant answers for everything. In silence, learn to wait, to trust, and to prepare ourselves for what will come. May silence be for us like breathing before speaking, the interval before music, the space between the waves of the sea. It is not empty, but full of meaning. When you remain silent, find the wisdom necessary to ask for what really matters. Number 3. Patience is the foundation of wisdom. Have you ever tried to rush something and ended up making the situation even more complicated? Impatience is like a building made without a foundation. It may seem solid at first, but at the slightest challenge, it crumbles. Patience is one of the greatest tests of faith and also one of the greatest instruments of wisdom. The author of Ecclesiastes reminds us, everything has its time, and there is a time for every purpose under heaven. Ecclesiastes chapter 3 verse 1. This verse is not just a lesson about waiting, but an invitation to understand that there is beauty and purpose in every moment. Even those when God's silence seems guaranteeing. Asking something from God requires more than words. It requires perseverance and faith in the right time. A powerful analogy is that of a farmer. He plants his seeds in the ground and needs to wait for the natural harvest cycle. He doesn't dig the ground every day to see if the seeds are growing, nor does he try to speed up the process. Instead, he waters, tends, and waits. The farmer's patience reflects his confidence in the process. In the same way, when we ask for something, we need to believe that the answer will come at the right time, even if it is not visible now. The Bible is full of stories that illustrate the importance of patience. Abraham, for example, received the promise that he would be the father of a great nation. However, he waited years for his son Isaac to be born. During this time, Abraham had doubts and even tried to help God, which resulted in the birth of Ishmael. Genesis chapter 16. This attempt to rush the promise had consequences, but it also teaches us that trusting God's timing is part of the process of spiritual growth. Another remarkable story is that of Joseph, sold into slavery by his own brothers. He spent years in prison before becoming governor of Egypt. During this waiting time, could have rebelled, given up, or made hasty decisions. But he appeared faithful and patient, and at the right time he was exalted. Genesis chapters 37 to 41. His patience not only transformed his life, but also saved his entire family and many others from starvation. Patience, however, is not passivity. It is active, like a rope that stretches without breaking. Imagine an archer pulling his bowstring. He doesn't release the arrow immediately, but waits for the right moment, adjusting his aim carefully. So is patience. It prepares us, strengthens us, and teaches us to wait with purpose. James encourages us to have this same patience when he writes, "See how the farmer waits for the precious fruit of the earth, waiting for it patiently, until he receives the early and late rains." James 5, 7. This waiting is accompanied by hope, because we know that God is working, even if we can't see it. In our everyday lives, impatience can lead us to impulsive decisions. Think of someone who is stuck in a traffic jam. A person irritated by the delay decides to take an unknown shortcut and ends up getting lost, spending even more time. That's how we are when we try to rush God's answers. We lose track of things, we get frustrated, and we end up further away from our original purpose. Patience is also a reflection of spiritual maturity. By learning to wait, we demonstrate trust in God, knowing that He sees beyond what we can see. This confidence is not easy to achieve, but it is what shapes us. Paul writes, "And not only this, but we also glory in tribulations, knowing that tribulation produces patience, and patience brings experience, and experience brings hope." Romans chapter 5 verses 3 and 4. Every moment of waiting is an opportunity for growth. Jesus also taught us the importance of patience in his parables. In Matthew's Gospel, he talks about the wheat and the tares. The owner of the field could have had the weeds pulled out immediately, but he waited until the harvest, so as not to have a deficiency in the wheat. Matthew chapter 13 verses 24 to 30. This parable shows us that patience is necessary to distinguish what is good from what is harmful, and that the right time reveals what really matters. Finally, patience is an exercise in faith. It's trusting that God is in control, even when statements tell us otherwise. It's believing that each day of waiting is not a day lost, but a day in which we are being prepared to receive something greater than we asked for. May we learn from biblical examples and cultivate patience as a foundation for our lives, knowing that everything has a purpose and a perfect time to happen. Number 4. Stories that were never asked of God. The greatest victories in our lives do not always come from explicit requests. Sometimes they arrive as a response to needs that we cannot even manifest, or as a consequence of a greater purpose that God has already prepared for us. There are times when the silence of the heart speaks louder than any words, and God acts with stability and wisdom, even without us having said a specific prayer. The Bible is full of stories in which God granted extraordinary victories to people who didn't even know how to ask. This teaches us that, more than our momentary desires, He knows our true needs. One of these stories is that of Moses and the people of Israel in the desert. When the Israelis were facing the Red Sea, surrounded by the Egyptian army, they panicked. "I didn't know what to do, much less how to ask for help." They only managed to complain. It was because there were no graves in Egypt that He brought us out of there, to die in this desert. Exodus chapter 14 verse 11. Moses, on the other hand, appears firm and confident that God would act. Without the people hearing their request, the sea was opened, and they crossed safely. This victory was not the result of a well-prepared prayer, but of God's grace in acting, even in the face of our inability to express what we need. Another remarkable story is that of Rahab. She was a woman from Jericho, a city destined for destruction. Rahab did not explicitly ask that his life be spared. She just acted in faith, hiding the spies sent by Joshua. In doing so, she demonstrated confidence in something greater than the imminent destruction of her city. His attitude resulted not only in his salvation, but also in the inclusion of his lineage in Jesus. Joshua chapter 2. Rab teaches us that even without requests, God can see our faith and honor us in ways we would never imagine. Think also of the bleeding woman who moved away from Jesus in the crowd. She didn't ask for help directly. Instead, she told herself, "If I just touch his clothes, I will be healed." Gospel of Mark chapter 5 verse 28. His action was discreet, almost anonymous, but full of faith. Jesus, upon noticing her attitude, stopped and declared, "Daughter, your faith has saved you. Go in peace and be free from your evil." Mark chapter 5 verse 34. This story shows us that God does not depend on eloquent words. He responds with sincere faith, even when it is expressed silently. The story of Joseph is also an example of how God grants victories without being asked for. Joseph was sold into slavery by his brothers and spent years suffering injustice and challenges. During all this time, we do not see Joseph going out to be exalted or to take revenge on his brothers. He just stayed true to where he was. However, God elevated him to a position of authority in Egypt, making him the second most powerful man in the kingdom. Genesis chapters 37 to 50. This turnaround was not something that Joseph asked for, but something that God prepared because he knew the purpose he had for his life. These stories reveal a powerful truth. God often ages in areas we can't even imagine because he sees beyond what we ask or think. Paul writes, "Now, the one who is able to do infinitely more than everything we ask or think, according to the power that works within us." Ephesians chapter 3 verse 20. This verse reminds us that we don't always need to know what to ask for. God already knows our needs and has plans greater than we can understand. In everyday life, we can see practical examples of this. Think of a small child who, when falling, reaches out to his parents without saying a word. She doesn't ask for words. Its need is evident. The parents lift her up, tend to her wounds, and set her back on her feet. Likewise, God often comes into our lives without us needing to verbalize each need. He understands our gestures, our silences, and even our tears. There is also the example of the disciples in the boat during the storm. They were terrified, believing they would perish. Jesus, who was sleeping peacefully, cried out and calmed the wind and the sea with just one word: "Calm down." Gospel of Mark, chapter 4 verse 39. Jesus' presence in the storm was already a response to a request that the disciples didn't even know how to make. This story reminds us that even when we are overcome by fear and confusion, God remains in control. These stories challenge us to reflect on how God works in our lives in unexpected ways, and often without us asking. This does not mean that we should not pray, but rather that we should trust that God knows what is best for us, even when we do not know how our needs are expressed. He went according to his expectation and purpose, bringing answers that often go beyond our understanding. Sometimes what we need is not more words, but more trust. Just as a field receives rain without asking for it, our lives are also achieved by victories that we did not expect. May these stories inspire us to see that God is always attentive to our needs, even when silence takes the place of words. 5. When God's response is silence. God's silence is one of the most challenging moments of the Christian journey. It's that moment when our requests echo with no apparent response, and the emptiness seems to become deafening. Many believe that silence is a form of exclusion, but the truth is that it is often a response in itself. The psalmist expressed this feeling when he cried out. This outburst reflects the anguish of those who cannot hear God's voice, but who still cling to the hope that he is present. Silence can be compared to the night before dawn. During darkness, it's hard to believe that the sun will rise, but it always comes out at the right time. Likewise, God's silence is not an abandonment, it is an interval where our faith is refined and our priorities are adjusted. Imagine a teacher during a test. He doesn't talk, doesn't guide, doesn't give tips. That doesn't mean he left the room. He is observing, allowing students to demonstrate what they have learned. So is God in our moments of silence. The story of Job is one of the most powerful examples of God's silence. Job lost everything: his children, his possessions, his health. At the height of his grief, he cried out for answers but received silence. He said, "Even so, Job mourns faithfully, even without understanding the reason for his suffering." When God finally responded, he did not give an explanation, but revealed his majesty and wisdom, showing that there was a greater purpose behind everything. Another story that illustrates God's silence is that of Martha and Mary when Lazarus was sick. They sent a message to Jesus asking him to come and heal their brother, but Jesus found him where he was for 2 more days. During this time, Lazarus died and the sisters were devastated. When Jesus finally arrived, Martha said, Jesus' silence seemed like denial. But it was actually preparation for something greater, the resurrection of Lazarus. In our everyday lives, God's silence can be as difficult as these biblical examples. Imagine someone who is unemployed, sending resume after resume, praying fervently for an opportunity but getting no answers. Or a mother who prays incessantly for the recovery of a sick child, without seeing any improvement. These moments can feel unbearable. But it is in them that they learn to trust, not in circumstances, but in the character of God. Silence can also be an invitation to introspection. Just as a mirror reflects our image, silence reflects our thoughts and motivations. It forces us to confront what we really want and why. Often, when reflecting during silence, we realize that our requests were misaligned with God's. Purpose. This pause teaches us to adjust our prayers and seek not just what we want, but what is necessary. The metaphor of a vessel being shaped by the potter is mentioned here. During the molding process, there are times when the potter stops to observe the vessel, assessing its shape before continuing. These moments of pause are not abandoned, they are part of the creation process. God's silence is like this. He is molding us even when we don't feel his hands directly. Isaiah reminds us that those who wait on the Lord will renew his strength. They will mount up with wings like eagles. They will run and not grow weary. They will walk and not be weary. Isaiah chapter 40 verse 31. Waiting implies resisting silence with patience and faith. It is during this period that we learn to depend not on answers, but on the presence of God, even when it is not tangible. Jesus also experienced God's silence. In the Garden of Gethsemane, he prayed, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Gospel of Matthew, chapter 27 verse 46. This cry of pain reveals Jesus' humanity, but it also teaches us that even in silence, God is present. The resurrection of Jesus was proof that silence is not the end of the story, that we hope to learn to embrace silence as part of the journey, knowing that it is not a void, but a space where God is working in our hearts and in our connections. Silence challenges us to trust, to grow and to wait for the right time, where everything will make sense. Number 6, metaphor of the potter and the clay. Life is full of moments when we feel incomplete, broken, or in disarray. In these moments it is common for us to seek quick answers and immediate changes. But the Bible presents us with a metaphor that challenges this rush. The potter and the clay. Jeremiah describes a powerful scene. He went down to the potter's house, and behold, he was doing his work on wheels. As the vessel he made out of clay fell into the hands of the potter, he made another vessel out of it according to what seemed good in his eyes. Jeremiah chapter 18, verses 3 and 4. This image invites us to reflect on the process of shaping our lives, which is much deeper than simply asking and receiving. The potter works patiently. He does not force the clay, but molds it with care and intention. In the same way, when we ask God for something, we must understand that he is shaping not only what we receive, but also who we are. Asking for wisdom, growth, or even answers to our struggles is like putting ourselves in the hands of the potter. This requires humility to accept that the process may be slow, but it is necessary for the result to be good. The potter metaphor also reminds us that the clay has no control over the process. Imagine the clay questioning the potter. "Why are you pressuring me like this? Why am I being spun around so fast?" Isaiah addresses this idea when he writes, "Woe to him who competes with his creator. Can clay tell what the model does?" Isaiah chapter 45, verse 9. We are often like this impatient clay, wanting to control a process that we do not fully understand. There is a dilemma that arises in this context. How do you balance the desire to ask for something with the willingness to trust the process? The answer is in the attitude of the clay in the potter's hands. He does not resist, but surrenders. Surrender to touch, which may seem painful at times, but which has a greater purpose. When we ask for something, we need to be willing to accept that the path to the answer can transform us more than the result itself. The story of Joseph in Egypt is a perfect example of this molding. He was betrayed by his brothers, sold into slavery, unjustly arrested, and forgotten in prison. During these years of suffering, could have rebelled or given up, but like clay in the potter's hands, he appears firm. When he finally became governor of Egypt, Joseph knew that the entire process, no matter how difficult it was, had a greater purpose. You planned evil against me, but God meant it for good, so that the lives of many would be preserved today. Genesis chapter 50 verse 20. Another story that illustrates molding is that of Peter. Before being shaped by Jesus, Peter was impulsive. I often spoke or acted without thinking. When he denied Jesus 3 times, he wooed himself like an imperfect vessel. But Jesus, like the potter, did not discard it. Instead, he restored him, transforming him into one of the most important leaders of the early church. This transformation was only possible because Pedro accepted being shaped, even if it meant facing his flaws. On a daily basis, we are faced with situations that challenge us to remain in the hands of the potter. Imagine an athlete who is training for a marathon. Training is painful, requires discipline and renunciation, but each step or preparation for the race. In the same way, every moment of waiting, every no or not yet that we receive in our prayers, is part of a spiritual training that shapes us for something greater. Molding also involves removing impurities. The potter needs the clay to remove air bubbles or leftover dirt that could compromise the structure of the vessel. This process can be uncomfortable, but it is essential. In our lives, this may mean giving up habits, attitudes, or relationships that prevent us from growing. It is at this moment that we understand that God is not only responding to our requests, but we are preparing ourselves for something better than we thought we could imagine. The potter's patience teaches us to trust in the right time. He does not rush the process, because he knows that a poorly made vessel will not withstand the test of fire. In Psalms we read, Psalms chapter 37, verse 5. This surrender is like allowing the potter to complete his work without interference or criteria. That we look at our lives through the eyes of a vessel in formation, understanding that each pressure, each turn of the wheel, each moment of waiting is part of a larger process. The true beauty of a vase lies in the potter's patience and the clay's willingness to be molded. Likewise, the answers we seek will not always come in the form or time we want, but they will certainly arrive as part of a greater purpose that transforms us into something beautiful and useful. Number 7. The petition that shapes the beggar. When we ask God for something, we report that we do not think about the impact that this act has on ourselves. We are so focused on what we want to receive that we forget that the process of asking also transforms us. Asking God is not just an exercise in faith, it is an opportunity for personal and spiritual growth. True wisdom is an understanding that while we wait for the answer, something greater is happening within us. In the book of James, there is an instruction that seems simple, but is profoundly transformative. If any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask God, who gives to all liberally and without reproach, and it will be given. James 1-5. The key word here is wisdom. When we ask for wisdom, we are not only seeking answers, but also learning to see the world with new eyes, to interpret our situations differently, and to grow in patience and faith. Imagine a sculptor working on a statue. Each strike of the chisel seems like a simple act, but it is intentional and cumulative. He not only creates a work of art, but also transforms a rough stone into something beautiful. Likewise, when we ask God for something, the act of asking and waiting shapes our character, removing what is necessary and revealing the person we are destined to become. The petition, in this sense, is more about what happens in us than about what we hope to receive. A clear example of this is the story of Hannah, Samuel's mother. Anna prayed fervently for a son, but her prayer went beyond a simple wish. She said, First Book of Samuel, chapter 1 verse 11. During the time Hannah waited for his answer, her heart was shaped. When she finally received Samuel, she was prepared to give him to God, demonstrating a level of faith and sacrifice that could only have been achieved through the process of asking and waiting. Another remarkable story is that of Solomon. When God granted him the opportunity to ask for anything, Solomon asked for wisdom to govern the people justly. He said, that you may prudently discern between good and evil. First Book of Kings, chapter 3 verse 9. This request, not only demonstrated humility, but also revealed the heart of a leader willing to be molded to fulfill his purpose. Solomon teaches us that the act of asking God for something can transform us into more conscious, responsible people and aligned with the greater good. In everyday life, this idea applies in a practical way. Think of someone who asks for patience during a difficult time. The request itself already starts a process of change. The person begins to notice their reactions, exercise self-control and look for ways to face challenges more calmly. even before receiving a tangible response. It is already being shaped. This is the transformative power of petition. The metaphor of the potter and the clay also applies here. When we are in the hands of the potter, the act of asking for something is like saying, "I am willing to be molded." Each request is an invitation for God to work in our lives, removing what stops us from growing and adding what makes us stronger and more resilient. The process may be uncomfortable, but the result is a life more in line with purpose. Jesus also showed us how petition can shape the beggar. In the Garden of Gethsemane, he prayed. This prayer was not just a request, it was a demonstration of surrender and submission. As he prayed, Jesus was preparing himself for the sacrifice to come. His prayer shaped him to face the challenge with courage and obedience. Asking for something also teaches us humility. It's important that we don't have all the answers and that we need help. Our independence often prevents us from admitting our weaknesses, but the act of asking puts us in a position of vulnerability that reminds us of our humanity. This humility is essential for spiritual growth, as it brings us closer to God and teaches us to depend on Him. The patience we develop when waiting for a response is also part of this process. Hope teaches us to trust, to rest in the certainty that God is at work, even if we cannot see, writes Paul. And not only that, but we also glory in tribulations, because we know that tribulation produces patience, experience, and experience, hope. Romans chapter 5, verses 3 and 4. Each step in this process shapes us in ways we can only understand, looking back. When we reflect on the impact of the petition on our lives, we realize that it is much more than a means of achieving something. It is a journey of transformation. With each request, we are putting ourselves in a place where we can be shaped, refined, and strengthened. And in the end, we realize that the greatest victory is not just the answer, but there is no growth that happens while we wait. Number 8. A wrong door may be open. Not all open doors lead to a good path. Sometimes what seems like an opportunity or an answer can actually be a distraction from the purpose God has for our lives. The Bible warns us about the danger of following paths that, to human eyes, seem right, but which end in destruction. There is a way that seems right to man, but its end is the path of death. Proverbs chapter 14, verse 12. This verse challenges us to reflect not only on the doors we want to go through, but also on what we are really looking for when asking God for something. Imagine being in front of two doors, a large, well-lit, with a sign that promises ease and prosperity. The other is narrow, unattractive, and difficult to perceive. Naturally, many would choose the first. However, Jesus tells us, Gospel of Matthew, chapter 7, verses 13 and 14. Not every open door is a victory. Some are traps masquerading as opportunities. A clear example of this is in the story of Jonah. God called him to go to Nineveh, but Jonah decided to flee in the opposite direction. He found a ship ready for Tarsus, a door apparently open. However, this decision led him to a personal crisis, and finally, into the belly of a big fish. Book of Jonah, chapters 1 and 2. The gate to Tarsus seemed convenient, but it was a diversion from God's purpose. This story teaches us that not every open door is permission to act. We need to discern whether it is truly aligned with God's will. In everyday life, this can be observed in our professional choices, relationships, or even in minor decisions. Think of someone who receives a job offer with a higher salary, but requires compromising values or saving themselves from family and faith. At first, the door seems attractive, but upon walking through it, a person may find themselves lost, exhausted, or dissatisfied. What seemed like a victory became a burden. This reminds us of the importance of asking for wisdom before walking through any door. The metaphor of a corridor with several doors illustrates this idea well. Imagine you are running towards a goal, but on the way there are many open doors, each with a different promise. If you get distracted and enter any one without thinking, you could get lost and never reach your final destination. This is life when we follow open doors without discernment. Wisdom lies in stopping, observing, and asking, does this door bring me closer or further away from the purpose God has for me? Another powerful story is that of Balaam. He received a tempting proposal to curse the people of Israel. Initially, it seemed like a lucrative opportunity, an open door for personal gain. But God begrudged an angel to block his path, and even a donkey spoke to warn him of danger. Numbers, chapter 22. The open door that Balaam wanted to walk through was, in fact, a path to disaster. This story reminds us that we need to pay attention to the signs and warnings that God gives us. Jesus also showed us how to discern doors in his desert trial. The devil presented seemingly open doors, offering him power, wealth, and recognition. Jesus rejected these offers, showing that not every opportunity comes from God. He knew that passing through these doors would mean compromising his mission. His example teaches us to carefully evaluate opportunities that arise, especially those that challenge our values and convictions. The difficulty in discerning the correct doors is often linked to our haste. When we're desperate for answers, we may accept anything that seems like a quick fix. However, this impulsiveness can lead us to walk through doors that take us away from what really matters. This is why prayer and patience are so essential. They help us slow down and seek guidance before making decisions. Asking God for wisdom is essential to discern which doors we should go through. James encourages us, "If any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask God, who gives to all liberally and without reproach, and it will be given." James, chapter 1, verse 5. This wisdom allows us to see beyond appearances and understand what is behind each opportunity. With it we can avoid doors that seem good, but that divert us from the right path. Waiting is also a tool for discernment. Sometimes God asks us not to go through any doors immediately, but to wait. This waiting is not inactivity. It is a time of preparation, where we learn to trust Him more than our own abilities. Just as the psalmist declared, "Wait for us to be protected from impulsive choices and prepare us for the doors we really must pass through." When reflecting on the doors in our lives, we must remember that true wisdom is not in how many doors we walk through, but in choosing the ones that lead us to our greater purpose. Not every open door is a victory. Some are shortcuts that take us away from the right path. The key is to discern, ask for wisdom, and trust that God will always guide us to the right door, even if it is not the most attractive or easy to see. Number 9, the hidden desires of the heart. We don't always know what we really want. Sometimes our requests to God are influenced by external expectations, by the ego, or by needs that we do not want to admit even to ourselves. The desires hidden in our hearts often shape our prayers and actions in ways we don't even realize. Jeremiah declares a disconcerting truth: "The heart is deceitful above all things, and wicked. Who can meet?" Jeremiah, chapter 17, verse 9. This verse challenges us to honestly examine our own desires before presenting them to God. Asking for something without understanding what really drives the request can be like navigating without a map. You might get somewhere, but it probably won't be where you want to be. A simple metaphor helps to understand this. Imagine a tree with deep roots. The fruits it produces do not just reflect the surface. They are the result of roots hidden beneath the earth. Likewise, the requests we make reflect the roots of our deepest desires, whether they are healthy or unhealthy. A clear example in the Bible is the people of Israel asking for a king. They said to Samuel that he should govern us as all the nations have. 1 Samuel 8-5. On the surface, it seemed like a legitimate request, but the underlying desire was insecurity and a lack of trust in God as their leader. Despite Samuel's warning about the consequences, the people insisted, and Saul was chosen as king. This request showed how hidden desires can lead to choices that, in the end, bring more challenges than solutions. Another example is the rich young man who moved away from Jesus. He asked, "Good master, what shall I do to inherit eternal life?" Gospel of Mark chapter 10 verse 17. It seemed like a noble desire, but when Jesus asked him to sell everything he had and follow him, the young man went away sad because he had many riches. His heart's true desire was not eternal life, but security in his material possessions. This shows us that, often, what we don't ask for corresponds to what we really want deep down. These examples invite us to do some self-analysis before presenting our requests. Think of someone who is now professionally successful. This request may be motivated by a legitimate desire to support the family or by a need for approval and recognition. Without honest reflection, it's easy to confuse a healthy desire with one that feeds the ego. This confusion can lead us to pursue things that ultimately do not bring peace or purpose. The metaphor of a mirror helps us understand this process. A mirror reflects exactly what is in front of it, but it doesn't reveal what's behind it. The desires hidden in the heart are like what is behind the mirror. They are not visible at first glance, but they are there, influencing our actions. When we ask God for something, it is essential to allow Him to reveal what is hidden in our hearts, so that we can align our desires with His will. Jesus gave us a great lesson about the desires of the heart in the Sermon on the Mount. Here, He He teaches us to put our priorities in the right place. When our desires are aligned with higher values like justice, love, and safety, our actions become deeper and more meaningful. In everyday life, this can be as practical as evaluating why we want something. Imagine someone who wants a new car. This desire may be motivated by practicality, such as the need to transport the family more safely. But it can also be motivated by vanity, such as the desire to impress others. The difference is not intentional behind the order, and that is what God wants us to examine. Asking God to reveal the desires of your heart is an act of courage. It means being willing to face uncomfortable truths about ourselves. In Psalm 37, the psalmist declares, "And He will give you the desires of your heart." Psalm chapter 37 verse 4. This verse does not promise that God will grant every whim, but that as we draw closer to Him, our desires will be transformed to align with what is good and just. That we can learn to examine our requests honestly, allowing God to reveal our true motivations from our heart. As our desires align with the values He teaches us, our prayers stop being just requests and become expressions of trust, purposefulness, and true faith. Number 10. The path of intelligent persistence. Persisting is not simply continuing to go without direction or purpose. Persisting wisely means learning, adjusting, and understanding the process as we pursue what we ask for. Intelligent persistence teaches us to have faith in the right time, to align our requests with greater purposes, and to shape our character along the way. Jesus left us a powerful example of this in the parable of the unjust judge. There was a judge in a certain city who neither had God nor respected man, and there was also in that city a widow who came to him, saying, "Grant me justice against my adversary." Gospel of Luke, chapter 18 verses 2 and 3. The widow, through her insistence, ended up getting justice, showing that the perseverance, when well directed, produces results. Intelligent persistence is like a sculptor working on a hard stone. He doesn't throw random punches. Each movement is calculated, with patience and strategy, until the desired shape is achieved. Likewise, when we ask God for something, our perseverance must be guided by faith and wisdom, rather than despair or purposeless repetition. We need to adjust our requests as we understand more about what God wants for us, and this is only possible with discernment and humility. A biblical example that reflects intelligent persistence is the Canaanite woman who sought help from Jesus. She cried out. At first, Jesus did not respond, and even the same students suggested she leave, but the woman persisted, saying, "Yes, Lord, but even puppies eat the crumbs that fall from their master's table." Matthew chapter 15 verses 20 and 7. His persistence, full of faith and humility, discovered in the healing of his daughter. This teaches us that it is not just the insistence that matters, but the way we draw closer to God during the process. Intelligent persistence also challenges us to understand that not all answers will come in our time. Think of Abraham, who was promised that he would be the father of many nations. He waited decades to see Isaac's birth. During this time, he had moments of doubt and even made bad decisions, such as fathering Ishmael with Hagar, thinking he was helping God fulfill his promise. Genesis chapter 16. This experience shows us that persistence without wisdom can lead us to shortcuts that create more problems than solutions. Learning from the process is essential to avoid these deviations. In everyday life, intelligent persistence can be seen in something as simple as learning a new skill. Imagine someone trying to learn to play the guitar. At first your fingers hurt, the notes come out wrong, and frustration is the result. But rather than giving up or repeating the same mistakes, a person adjusts their practice, seeks guidance, and keeps trying with purpose. Likewise, when asking God for something, we need to adjust our approach, understand our motivations, and trust the process. The farmer metaphor also illustrates this idea well. He doesn't plant the seeds and stand still, waiting for them to magically sprout. He waters, removes organic weeds, and protects the raw plantation. Persisting in prayer is like taking care of a worker, require patience, care, and trust in the natural cycle of things. The Apostle Paul wrote, "And we do not grow weary in doing good, for at the right time we will reap, if we do not give up." Galatians chapter 6 verse 9. The harvest always comes to those who persist intelligently and consistently. Jesus also gave us another powerful example of persistence in prayer. In the parable of the annoying friend, a man knocked on his friend's door at midnight, asking for bread to feed a visitor. Although reluctant, the friend ended up answering because of his insistence. Jesus concludes by saying, Gospel of Luke chapter 11, verses 9 and 10. This teaching encourages us to continue, but also to do so with faith and purpose, trusting that an answer will come at the right time. Unintelligent persistence, on the other hand, can lead to frustration. Imagine someone trying to forcefully open a locked door, without realizing that the key is right next to it. Persisting without observing what God is teaching us during the process is like trying to open that door by force. True wisdom is to consider that the process of waiting and insisting is as important as the response itself. James reminds us that patience is an essential part of this process. My brothers, consider it a source of great joy to pass through various trials, because you know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance. James 1, verses 2 and 3. Every moment of waiting teaches us something, whether about God or ourselves. This learning turns hope into a time of growth, rather than just a time of distress. By persisting with intelligence, learning to trust God, even when the answer seems to take time. It's not about endlessly repeating the same request, but about adjusting our posture, understanding our motivations and seeking the greater purpose behind each situation. Intelligent persistence is an act of active faith, shaping us as we wait and prepare to receive what we truly need. Number 11. The cost of asking without faith. Asking God for something without faith is like trying to cross a river on a bridge that wasn't built. It doesn't matter how the prayer was designed or how much we want an answer. Without faith, the request loses its essence and connection. The Bible warns us about this. But ask in faith without doubting, for he who doubts is like a wave of the sea, which is carried by the wind and tossed from one place to another. Let such a man not think that he will receive anything from the Lord. James 1, 6 and 7. This verse makes it clear that doubt is not just an obstacle, it is the very reason why many prayers remain unanswered. Faith is the foundation of any request. Imagine a farmer who plants seeds but doesn't believe they will germinate. He doesn't invest time in looking, doesn't protect the plantation, and, in a short time, leaves the field. So are those who ask without faith. They abandoned prayer before the answer came because they did not understand the process or the certainty that God is listening. Lack of faith turns the act of asking into something empty, without purpose, and without power. A powerful biblical example of the cost of asking without faith is in the story of the people of Israel leaving Egypt. God promised to lead them to a land flowing with milk and honey, but when they got close, the spies sent to explore the land brought frightening reports about the giants that lived there. Instead of trusting the promise, the people murmured and decided to enter. They asked for security, but they did not have the faith to trust what God had already guaranteed. The result, they wandered in the desert for 40 years, until a new generation rose up with enough faith to enter the promised land. Numbers, chapters 13 and 14. Another striking example is Peter walking on the water. At first, his faith was enough to keep him going, but when he noticed the wind and waves, he began to doubt and immediately began to sink. He cried out. Jesus held him up and said, "O you of little faith, why did you doubt?" Matthew chapter 14, verse 31. This story shows us that a lack of faith not only prevents us from receiving an answer, it can make us sink in the middle of the process. Lack of faith is often rooted in fear. When we face challenges or difficult situations, it is natural to feel insecure. However, faith invites us to look beyond what we can see and trust those in control. Think of a child jumping into a parent's arms. She doesn't analyze the distance or wonder about her father's strength. She just trusts and jumps. This kind of faith is what allows us to ask with confidence, knowing that God is ready to sustain us. A metaphor that illustrates the impact of faith on our requests is that of a light bulb. Prayer is like a lamp, but faith is the energy that lights it. Without energy, the lamp is just an object without function. Likewise, without faith, our prayers become empty words. They can be beautiful, elaborate, and exciting, but without a faith connection, they have no power. In everyday life, asking without faith can be compared to someone applying for a job but not believing they will be hired. This person doesn't prepare specifically, doesn't trust their abilities, and enters the interview defeated before they even start. This attitude decreases your chances of success. Not because he wasn't defeated, but because I didn't believe he could achieve the goal. So it is with our prayers. When we ask without faith, we are saying, in essence, that we do not understand God's ability to respond. Jesus taught us the power of faith in diverse graces. In one of them, he said, "Faith, even in small proportions, is enough to move mountains." This teaches us that the size of our faith does not need to be gigantic, but it needs to be true and active. James also warns us about faith without action. He writes, James chapter 2 verse 17, "The cost of asking without faith is not just a lack of response, it is the loss of the opportunity to grow spiritually." Faith transforms us while we wait. She teaches us to trust, to rest, and to remain firm, even when situations seem unfavorable. When we ask with faith, our connection with God strengthens and our outlook on life changes. A lack of faith, on the other hand, leaves us stagnant, trapped in fear and doubt. That we thought reflect on the way we approach God in prayer. Asking in faith is not about being absolutely sure of how or when the answer will come, but about trusting that God is listening and that He knows what is best. By doing this, not only do our prayers become more powerful, but our relationship with God deepens, making us stronger and more confident in life's journey. Number 12. The contrast between Solomon and the rich fool. The contrast between Solomon and the rich fool reveals two completely different approaches to how to ask and what to ask for. Both were faced with important decisions, but while one sought wisdom to fulfill a greater purpose, the other was driven by selfish desires that led him to a tragic end. These stories teach us that what we ask for and the motivation behind our requests determine not only what we receive, but also its impact on our lives. Solomon was a young king with an enormous challenge, leading a nation. When God appeared to him in a dream and offered him the chance to ask for anything, Solomon made a remarkable request, that he would prudently discern between good and evil. First Book of Kings, chapter 3 verse 9. Solomon could have asked for riches, longevity, or the defeat of his enemies, but he chose wisdom. This request pleased God, who not only granted him wisdom, but also riches and honor. Solomon's choice teaches us the importance of aligning our requests with a purpose greater than ourselves. On the other hand, Jesus bypassed the parable of the rich fool, a man who accumulated many goods and decided to build bigger barns to store his wealth. He said to himself, "Rest, come, drink and relax." Gospel of Luke, chapter 12 verse 19. However, that same night, God said to him, "You fool, tonight they will ask you for your soul, and what are you prepared for? Who will it be for?" Luke chapter 12 verse 20. The rich fool did not ask for wisdom, nor did he seek a greater purpose. He just accumulated it for himself, without thinking about the impact of his actions or their eternal value. These two stories represent choices we make every day. Solomon sought something that would benefit others and honor God, while the rich and foolish man was guided by selfishness. We are often tempted to make requests that only feed our immediate desires, without considering how they impact our spiritual life or the lives of those around us. The difference between the two was not just in what they asked for, but in the intention of their hearts. The metaphor of a fruit tree can help us understand this. A tree that receives sufficient care and nutrients produces fruit that benefits many. However, a tree that grows only for itself, without bearing fruit, ends up being cut down and rendered useless. When our requests are based on a higher purpose, like Solomon's, they become like fruits that bless others. But when they are like those of the rich and foolish, they end up being useless and even ambitious. In everyday life, this can be seen in how we prioritize our choices and requests. Imagine someone who prays for a promotion at work. This request itself is not wrong, but the motivation behind it makes all the difference. If a promotion is sought solely for status or wealth, it can become a burden. But if it is sought so that a person can be a positive influence and bless other lives, it aligns with a greater purpose. James warns us about the dangers of asking with wrong motivations. This warning calls us to reflect on what we are really looking for when making our requests. Are we asking for wisdom like Solomon, or are we hoarding it for ourselves like the rich fool? The answer to this question determines the impact of our requests on our lives and the world around us. Jesus also taught us to seek what is eternal. He said, "Lay not up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and rust corrupt and where thieves break in and steal, but lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven." Gospel of Matthew, chapter 6, verses 19 and 20. This lesson reinforces that true value lies in the choices we make with a greater purpose in mind. Solomon's request was an example of laying up treasures in heaven, while the rich fool spent his life accumulating treasures that had no eternal value. However, seeking what is eternal does not mean neglecting our daily needs. Solomon was blessed with riches because he asked for something greater than them. God knows our needs and gives us what is necessary to fulfill our purpose. The rich and foolish man's problem was not his wealth, but his lack of vision and purpose. He did not use his resources to help others or glorify God. He accumulated them only for himself. Asking wisely is like building a solid foundation for our lives. Solomon, by asking for wisdom, built a foundation that sustained his leadership and influenced generations. The rich and foolish man, on the other hand, built his life on sand, accumulating without purpose and without preparation for eternity. These choices reflect what really matters, not what we accumulate, but what we leave as an impact, which we think we learn from the contrast between Solomon and the rich fool. As we make our requests, may they be guided by wisdom. May we make them aligned with a greater purpose and based on the desire to benefit not only ourselves, but also those around us. Thus, our choices will have lasting value and reflect a truly transformed heart. 13. The difference between necessity and vanity. Not everything we want is really necessary. Often, our requests to God are motivated by fleeting desires that have no relevance to our spiritual life or purpose. The Bible teaches us to discern between what we need and what we ask for just to feed our ego. Gospel of Matthew, chapter 6, verse 33. This verse challenges us to put our priorities in the right place, focusing on what really matters and leaving aside what is superficial. Imagine someone who is lost in the desert. Your needs are clear: water, shelter, and safety. However, if this person focused on asking for jewelry or comfortable clothes, this would not only be useless, but also dangerous, as it would ignore what is essential to survive. So are many of our requests to God. Sometimes we are so focused on the superfluous things that we follow, or that we really need to grow and live fully. A biblical example that illustrates this contrast is the story of Martha and Mary, while Jesus was at their house. Martha was busy with preparations, worried about tasks that, although important, were not essential at that moment. Mary, on the other hand, sent herself to Jesus' feet to hear his words. When Martha complained, Jesus responded, "Martha, Martha, is anxious and worried about many things, but only one is necessary. Maria chose a good part that will not be taken away." Gospel of Luke, chapter 10, verses 41 and 42. This story teaches us that not everything that seems urgent is really important. King Solomon also offers us a reflection on the vanity of human desires. In Ecclesiastes he writes, "Despite his wisdom and wealth, Solomon discovers that many of the things we pursue are fleeting and do not bring satisfying faithfulness." He warns us not to get lost in desires that, in the end, have no real value. In everyday life, the difference between necessity and vanity can be observed in our choices and priorities. Imagine someone who wants a new car. This desire can be a legitimate need, such as transportation to work or family, but it can also be motivated by vanity, such as impressing others or achieving social status. The motivation behind the request is what defines whether it is a need or an empty desire. The metaphor of a balloon full of air helps illustrate vanity. A balloon may look big and impressive, but the bottom is empty. This is how desires feed the ego. They seem important in the moment, but when examined closely, they have no substance or lasting value. Asking God for something without considering a true need is like fillings that will eventually burst, leaving only emptiness. James warns us about the danger of asking with wrong motivations. This verse challenges us to reflect on the reason for our requests. Are we seeking something we really need, or are we just feeding desires that have no purpose? Another biblical example is the construction of the Tower of Babel. People planned to build a tower that reached the sky, not because they needed it, but to achieve fame and recognition. They said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower whose top reaches the heavens, and we will make a name for ourselves." Genesis chapter 11 verse 4. The project was interrupted by God, showing that desires motivated by vanity have no solid foundation. Jesus taught us to pray in a simple way and focused on the essentials. "Give us our daily bread today." Gospel of Matthew chapter 6 verse 11. This part of the Lord's Prayer reminds us to ask for what we really need, trusting that God knows our needs and will provide according to his plan. Asking for daily money is an act of humility, allowing you to not need excess, but just enough for each day. Discerning between need and vanity requires self-knowledge and sincerity. Our desires are often influenced by what we see around us. Social pressure, comparison with others, the desire for approval. When asking God for something, it is important to reflect, is this really necessary for my life, or am I being influenced by something external? This question helps us align our desires with what has true value, so that we can learn a priori what really matters. When we align our requests with genuine needs and a greater purpose, we find peace and purpose. Desires based on vanity only distract us and take us away from what really matters. To ask wisely is to choose what is essential, leaving aside what is fleeting and worthless. 14. The answer may be no. We don't always hear what we want when we turn to God in prayer. Sometimes, in your wisdom, the answer is no. For many, this word is difficult to accept, especially when we are sure that our requests are legitimate or even necessary. However, the Bible shows us that God's no is as significant as his yes, because it reflects the care he has for us and his greater purpose for our lives. Paul, one of the greatest apostles in history, experienced this on his own journey. He reports that he prayed for God to remove a thorn in the flesh that tormented him. Because of this, I asked the Lord 3 times to take him away from me. But he said to me, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness." According to the letter to the Corinthians, chapter 12, verses 8 and 9. The no that Paul received was not a sign of abandonment, but a lesson that God's grace was sufficient to sustain him in any circumstance. Imagine a child asking for something they really want, like candy. Before dinner, the loving parent knows that the candy at that moment is not good for her, even though the child's request is sincere and full of expectations. By saying no, he is not being indifferent, he is taking care of the child's well-being. Likewise, God does not answer some of our prayers, because he sees beyond the present moment and understands the impact that request could have on our lives. A clear example in the Bible is the story of Moses. After leading the Israelites for 40 years, in the desert, Moses asked God to allow him to enter the promised land. However, God replied, "Enough, don't tell me any more about this matter." Deuteronomy chapter 3 verse 26. Moses did not enter the promised land, but this did not diminish his role as a leader and servant of God. This response shows us that God's no can be a way of redirecting us or teaching us something serious about obedience and purpose. Sometimes God's no is a protection against something we can't see. Think of a person who prays incessantly to get a specific job but is not selected. Later, it is discovered that the company's work environment was toxic and could have harmed his mental or spiritual health. What didn't seem like a momentary frustration was, in fact, a form of care. The metaphor of a lost navigator helps to understand this. Imagine someone who wants to cross a river and sees an apparently solid bridge. When he tries to cross, he discovers that the bridge is broken and he cannot cross. What I didn't find at that moment may have saved him from a disastrous fall. So it is with God. He closes doors to protect us from paths that could harm us. Jesus also experienced failure on his journey. In the Garden of Gethsemane, despite his request, Jesus knew that God's will would prevail. What he did not receive paved the way for humanity's redemption, showing that God's purpose is always greater than our momentary situations. The dilemma that many face when listening is not the feeling of withdrawal or abandonment. However, the no means that God doesn't care. It means he has something better or different prepared. In Romans, we read, Romans chapter 8, verse 28. Even when the answer seems difficult to accept, we can trust that it is part of a greater plan. Discerning what is not of God requires spiritual maturity. We are often so focused on our desires that we fail to see the whole picture. Silence after a prayer or a closed door can be a way for God to tell us that something needs to be adjusted in our lives before we receive what we ask for. He may be teaching us to trust more, to rely less on external statistics, or to realign our values. May we see God's no not as an end, but as an opportunity to grow, learn, and trust in his ways. No can be the beginning of something bigger, an invitation to seek understanding and align our hearts with what really matters. Every unreceived is proof that God is attentive, guiding us and working for our good, even when we don't fully understand at the moment. Number 15. Ask for the kingdom and not for yourself. The essence of a powerful and effective prayer is not the intention behind the request, When we ask God for something, our motivation must go beyond our individual needs and align with the values of God's kingdom. Jesus taught us this priority when he said, "This verse challenges us to redirect our requests, placing the kingdom as the central objective." Asking for something from the kingdom is like investing in a future harvest. Imagine a farmer who plants seeds, knowing that the fruits will not only be for him, but to feed his community. He cares for the plantation with dedication, because he understands that the impact of his harvest will be greater than his own needs. When we ask with the purpose of glorifying God and benefiting others, our requests become seeds that bear abundant fruit. A clear example in the Bible is Solomon's request for wisdom. When God gave him the opportunity to ask for anything, Solomon responded. This request was not selfish. He reflected the desire to govern justly and serve the people wisely. God not only granted the request, but also granted Solomon riches and honor, showing that when we prioritize the kingdom, we receive much more than we asked for. On the other hand, Jesus warned us against the danger of asking with selfish motives in the parable of the Pharisee and the tax collector. The Pharisee prayed, extolling his own virtues, while the publican, in humility, cried out for mercy. Jesus concluded, "Everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, and whoever humbles himself will be exalted." Gospel of Luke, chapter 18, verse 14. This story reminds us that asking for something just to enhance ourselves or satisfy personal desires distances us from God's greater purpose. In everyday life, asking for the kingdom means aligning our goals with the values of love, justice, and compassion. Imagine someone praying for finances. This request in itself is not wrong, but when the motivation is just to accumulate wealth, he loses focus on the kingdom. If, however, the purpose is to use this prosperity to help those in need, invest in missions or support projects that impact lives, the request aligns with something greater than personal interest. A metaphor that illustrates this idea well is that of a water channel. A canal that closes, holding all the water for itself, eventually becomes stagnant and unproductive. But a canal that allows water to flow freely, supplying fields and communities, remains alive and useful. When we ask for something for the kingdom, we become channels through which God can bless other people. The Apostle Paul is an example of someone who lived and asked for the kingdom. In his letters we see that his prayers were not focused on comfort or personal well-being, but on strength and direction to fulfill his mission. He wrote, "Therefore we also do not cease to pray for you, that you may be filled with knowledge of his will in all wisdom and spiritual understanding." Letter to the Colossians, chapter 1, verse 9. This prayer reflects the desire to see others grow in faith in God's purpose. Jesus also taught us to ask for the kingdom in the Lord's Prayer. These words show us that our prayers must be aligned with God's will and the advancement of the kingdom. Asking for the kingdom to come is asking that our lives and actions reflect the values of justice, love, and peace that Jesus taught. Dividing between a selfish request and a request for the kingdom requires reflection and honesty. Often our desires are motivated by external pressures or the search for status. When we bring our requests to God, we invite the question, how will this contribute to the kingdom? Does this request glorify God or to satisfy a personal desire? This reflection helps us align our hearts with what really matters. Asking for the kingdom also teaches us to trust that God will provide for our needs. We pursue his purposes. When we put the kingdom first, we destroy the victories we receive are more than enough for our lives. This principle is an invitation to live generously and selflessly, knowing that our reward is not just what we receive, but also the impact we make on those around us. May our actions be like those of Solomon, Paul, and so many others who placed the kingdom as a priority. When we ask with a heart aligned with the values of God, our lives become instruments for something greater, and our requests are no longer just about what we want, but start to reflect what God wants to accomplish through us. This is living and asking for the kingdom.